Hello Prep 3, how are you? Now we're gonna talk about Unit 3, Gene and Genetics, Lesson 1, the main principles of heredity. So please pay attention, there is a very important lesson. The main principle of heredity. In this lesson, we have two types of traits. The first type is hereditary traits. Hereditary traits. What's meant by hereditary traits? Hereditary traits, they are traits that are transmitted from one generation to another. How? Like in this picture. Look at this picture. We can observe the transmission of smoothness, hair, smoothness of the hair from the parent to children, and we can observe the transmission of narrow eyes. Can you see transmission of narrow eyes from the parents to children? Okay, so who can tell me what's meant by hereditary traits? Yeah, excellent. They are traits that are transmitted from one generation to another, such as hair color, skin color, number of fingers, and the blood groups, and so on. Such as color of the eyes, color of the hair, and so on. The second type of traits is called acquired traits. It's called what? Acquired traits. What I meant by acquired traits? Acquired traits, they are traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another. Can't transmit from one generation to another. Like what? Like skill of playing football. Like in this picture. Skill of playing football can't transmit from one generation to another, but this is acquired traits, not hereditary traits. Like learning of swimming and speaking in many languages, learning of walking in children, and so on. So now, who can tell me what's meant by acquired traits? Yeah, traits that aren't transmitted from one generation to another, such as skill of playing football or writing, and so on. Now we have two types of traits, which are, yeah, I need to hear you. Yeah, exactly. Hereditary traits and acquired traits. One of them are transmitted from one generation to another, and this is called hereditary trait. And the other aren't transmitted from one generation to another, and this is called, yeah, acquired traits. Now, there is a science that researches about transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another. This science is called genetics. This science is called genetics. So, what's meant by genetics? It is a science search about transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another by studying the similarities and differences between the parent and offspring. Okay, What's meant by genetics again? Genetics is a science that researches about what? Researches about transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another by studying the similarities and differences between the parents and offspring. The science is called genetics. Now we're gonna talk about Mendel scientist. Mendel scientist is the first scientist who placed the basic of heredity. Who the Mendel scientist is the scientist who placed the basic of heredity. Okay? Mendel do an experiment to study the transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another. Mendel chose the garden pea plants for this experiment. Here, there is a very important question. Give reason. Mendel chose the garden pea plants for his experiment because number 1, easy to be planted and fast grow. Pea plants, easy to be planted and fast grow. Number 2, its life cycle is short. Number 3, its flower are hermaphrodite, thus it can do self-pollination. Can you remember what they meant by hermaphrodite? Hermaphrodite means the flower that contains male organs and female organs. And we can call this flower bisexual flower. So this is hermaphrodite or bisexual flower. Hermaphrodite flower means the flower contains male organ and female organs. Number 4, it can be easily artificially pollinated as they produced hermaphrodite flowers. So it can do a self-pollination or easily artificially pollinated. Number 5, it produces a large number of offspring in one generation. Produces large number of offspring in one generation. Number 6, there are several contrasting traits that can be easily recognized. The contrasting traits here in pea plants, such as some of pea plants produce red flower and the other produce white flower, and some of pea plants produce yellow seeds and the other produce green seeds. So this is a contrasting trait that can be easily recognized. Red flower or white flower, yellow seeds or green seeds, and these, for example, hermaphrodite flower, male flower, and female flower. These are the structure of 3 types of flower. You must know them. Firstly, hermaphrodite flower, you can see that it has both of male organs and female organs, both of them, male organs and female organs. So this flower is called hermaphrodite. Number 2, male flower. The male flower contains only the male organs, as you see in this picture. Anther and filament. This is the male organs. Female flower contains female organs only: stigma, style, and ovary. And these are called pistil. Okay? Now, let's study Mendel's experiment to study the seed color of the pea plants. And now, Mendel did an experiment to study the transmission of hereditary traits from one generation to another in pea plants. Okay? Mendel planted pea plants that produces yellow seeds and another one that produce green seeds for many generations. Here is a very important question. Give reason. Mendel planted pea plants produces yellow seeds and another one that produce green seeds for many generations. Why for many generations? To make sure of the purity of these traits. To make sure of the purity of these traits. Which traits? Yellow seeds and green seeds. Mendel wanted to be sure that the yellow seeds is a pure trait, pure yellow. And he wanted to be sure that the green seeds are pure traits, pure green. Okay? Let's see. He made that by self-pollination. What happens? He planted the pea plants that produces yellow seeds. This is the parent seed, and this is the first generation. All of the first generation is yellow seeds, and this is the second generation. All of the second generation also yellow seeds. On the other hand, he planted the pea plants produce green seeds, and he observed that the first generation all of them are green seeds, and the second generation all of them also are green seeds. From this experiment, Mendel observed that the plants that have yellow seeds produce plants with yellow seeds a generation after generation, and also plants that have green seeds produce plants with green seeds a generation after generation. So he concluded that the color of seeds is pure in plant he had planted. He concluded that the plant produced yellow seeds contains pure traits. Why? Why he concluded that the yellow seeds is pure traits? Because during planting the yellow seeds produces a generation with yellow seeds generation after generation. On the other hand, he concluded that the green seeds is a pure trait. Why? Because during planting seeds with green seed, he observed that the first generation and the second generation and all of the generations contains green seeds only. Okay? Then he planted the seeds of both plants, which produce yellow seeds and green seeds, and after growing he removed the stamen. What is the stamen here? The stamen is male organs that contains anther and filament. So after growing he removed the stamen of these plants before they become mature. Why? Here is a very important question. Give reason. Mendel removed the stamen of these plants before they become mature. The answer will be to control the pollination. To control the pollination. Mendel wanted to prevent the self-pollination. How can he prevent the self-pollination? By removing the stamen. So now he controlled the self-pollination. Number 3, by means of cross-pollination, he pollinated flowers of the plants which produce yellow flowers with pollens from the plants which produce green flowers, and vice versa. Then he covered the stigma of pistils. Again, in the previous step, Mendel wanted to prevent self-pollination, so he removed the stamen. Now, in the third step, he wanted to do a cross-pollination or mixed pollination. So he planted the pea plants produce yellow flowers or yellow seeds with pollen grains from the plants which produce green flowers. Then he covered stigma of pistils. Give reason. Mendel covered the stigma of pistils after cross-pollination. Why? In order to prevent pollination from the other flower. He wanted to do the pollination or cross-pollination from plants produce yellow seeds to the plants produce green seeds only. And he wanted to prevent the pollination from the other flower. So he covered the stigma of pistils. Okay? Now, what about the observation of this experiment? Mendel observed that by planting the pea plants that produce yellow seeds and did cross-pollination with the other plants produce green seeds, these are the parents. He observed that the first generation, all of them are yellow seeds. Okay? So, by crossing pollination between plants produce yellow seeds with other plants produce green seeds, Mendel observed that the first generation, all of them are plants with yellow seeds. 100% yellow seeds. 100% yellow seeds. And also he observed that in the first generation, the plants produce green seeds disappear completely. Okay? Now, Mendel let the first generation plants, this is the first generation plants, to do self-pollination. Then he planted the resulting seeds. What about the observations now? He observed that the second generation contains 75% yellow seeds and 25% green seeds, by the ratio 3 yellow to 1 green. Now please listen carefully to these questions. They are very important questions. Number 1. Give reason. Mendel called the yellow color of seeds is a dominant traits. Mendel called yellow color of seeds is a dominant traits. Why? Because the yellow seeds dominant over green color. Yellow seeds dominant over green color, and it appears with a percentage 100% in the first generation. Again, give reason. Mendel called the yellow color of seeds is a dominant trait because it dominates over the green color and appears in the first generation at percentage of 100%. Appears in the first generation with the percentage of 100% yellow seeds. So the yellow seeds is called dominant traits. Okay? Number 2, Mendel called the green color of seeds is recessive traits. Pay attention. Green color is called recessive traits. Recessive traits. Here is a dominant traits and green is recessive traits. Why? Because it disappears completely in the first generation. As you see in the first generation, there is no seeds with green color. Because it disappears completely in the individuals of the first generation. At the end, Mendel concluded that the plants produce yellow seeds or yellow color seeds is a dominant trait. Why yellow color seeds is dominant traits? Because it appears by 100% in the first generation. And he called the green seeds with recessive traits. Why? Because it disappears completely in the first generation. Now we can conclude that what's meant by dominant traits? Who can tell me what's meant by dominant traits? Dominant traits, they are traits that appear in the first generation by a percentage of 100%. And what's meant by recessive traits? Recessive traits, they are traits that disappear completely in the first generation. Very important concepts. Please pay attention. You must know these concepts. Dominant gene and pure dominant traits. Dominant gene with a dominant gene produce pure dominant traits. And here in the second case, dominant gene with recessive gene produces impure dominant traits. In the third case, recessive gene with another recessive gene produce pure recessive traits. Now, from these diagrams, we can conclude many definitions. Number 1. Who can tell me what's meant by pure dominant trait? I can define pure dominant trait by it is a trait appears when aggregation means joining or collection or a combination, okay, aggregation of two similar genes, like in the first case, this is dominant gene and dominant gene, to produce pure dominant trait. So what's meant by pure dominant trait? I can say it is a trait that appears when aggregation between two dominant genes. Okay? In the second case, who can tell me what's meant by impure dominant trait? What's meant by impure dominant trait? Yeah, I can say that the trait that appears when aggregation of dominant gene and recessive gene. Dominant gene, one dominant gene and one recessive gene. So this is produce impure dominant trait. Impure dominant trait. In the third case, who can tell me what's meant by pure recessive trait? Pure recessive trait. It is a trait. Yeah, huh? Excellent. Yeah, it is a trait that appears when aggregation of two recessive genes. Like in the third case. Now, pay attention, please. Pay attention. Can you see this case produce pure, and the third case pure? What can you conclude from these two definitions? Pure traits, here is a pure dominant traits and here is a pure recessive traits. In general, pure traits produced from aggregation between two similar genes. Here dominant and dominant produce pure dominant. Recessive and recessive produce pure and recessive. Pure recessive trait. So if I have two similar genes, this is produce pure trait. Even they are two dominant genes, so this is produce pure dominant trait. Or two recessive genes, so this is produce pure recessive trait. Okay? Okay. Look at the second case. Here we have two different genes. One of them is dominant and the other is recessive. Dominant and recessive. Different genes, so this is produce impure. This is produce a impure dominant traits. Why we can't say here impure recessive traits? Pay attention. Recessive trait is always pure. Again, recessive trait is always pure. We can't say impure recessive trait. Recessive trait must be produced from aggregation between recessive gene and recessive gene. But during aggregation between dominant gene and recessive gene, this is produced dominant trait, not recessive trait. But here is impure dominant trait, as it has a recessive gene here, one recessive gene. Pay attention again. Dominant trait may be pure dominant and it may be impure dominant. Pure dominant when it produces from aggregation between two dominant genes, and impure dominant when excellent, when it produces from aggregation between one dominant and one recessive gene. What about recessive trait? Recessive trait is always pure. To produce recessive trait here, it must be produced from aggregation between two similar recessive genes to produce a pure recessive trait. But we have pure dominant trait or impure dominant trait, but we have only pure recessive trait. We don't have impure recessive trait. Now we have another concept. Number one, pure individual, and here hybrid individual, and here pure individual again. So from this diagram, who can conclude what's meant by pure individual? Here we have a pure individual and here we have a pure individual. Yeah, pure individual that carries a similar pairs of genes, either dominant traits or recessive traits. Again, pure individual that carries a similar pair of genes, either dominant traits, like in the first case, or recessive traits, like in the third case. So the dominant trait, pure dominant trait, or recessive trait appear appears on the individual. Pure dominant trait or recessive trait appear on the individual. Again, what's meant by pure individual? It is the individual that carries similar pairs of genes, either dominant traits, like in the first case, or recessive traits, like in the third case. So the dominant traits, pure dominant traits or recessive traits appears on the individual. On the other hand, who can tell me what's meant by hybrid individual? Hybrid individual. From this diagram in the second case. Yeah, it is the individual that carries different pairs of genes. One is dominant gene and the other is recessive gene. So what is the trait that appears on the individual now? What is the trait that appears on the individual now? Yeah, impure dominant traits appears on the individual. Impure dominant traits appears on the individual. Again, number 1, who can tell me what is meant by pure individual? We have a pure individual here in the first case and pure individual in the third case. Pure individual from the first case, it is the individual that carries similar pair of genes, either they are dominant genes or recessive genes, and the traits that appear on the individual now, pure dominant traits or pure recessive traits. What's meant by hybrid individual? It is the individual that produces from a combination between pair of genes of one dominant trait and the other recessive trait. So the trait that appears on the individual now is impure dominant trait. Now, the last concept that we can conclude from this observation is the principle of complete dominance. Look at the observation carefully. What's meant by principle of complete dominance? Principle of complete dominance means the appearance of dominant hereditary traits in the individuals of first generation. Like in this first generation, we observe the appearance of dominant hereditary traits. We said that yellow seeds is dominant hereditary traits as they appear in the first generation by 100%. So what meant by principle of complete dominance? It is the appearance of dominant hereditary traits in the individual of the first generation when two individuals are crossed. One of them carries a pure trait contrasting the trait carried by the other individual. Again, what's meant by the principle of complete dominance? Principle of complete dominance, we can conclude its definition from this observation. Principle of complete dominance, it is the appearance of dominant traits. It is the appearance of dominant traits in the individuals of the first generation when two individuals are crossed. When two individuals are crossed, one of them carries a pure trait. One of them carries a pure trait contrasting the trait carried by the other individual. Contrasting the trait carried by the other individual. And here you can see the definition of principle of complete dominance. What is meant by principle of complete dominance? Yeah, it is the appearance of dominant hereditary traits in the individuals of the first generation when two individuals are crossed over. One of them carries a pure trait contrasting the trait carried by the other individual. Pay attention. Pure trait may be dominant trait and may be recessive trait.